Mabel's voice tore through the trading post hall like a blade. "Your translator is lying!" For half a heartbeat, the world became a flicker of danger. Tatanka Mani's hand shifted toward the grip of his pistol. A chair leg scraped hard against the plank floor as someone jolted upright. On the table, the fresh ink of the contract bled where a trembling finger smeared the page, turning neat words into a dark bruise. Then everything froze. The Fort Belknap Trading Post was full tonight, of fur men with cracked knuckles, merchants with silver watch chains, Nakota warriors standing like carved stone along the wall, and at the center, Josiah McAllister sat with a gold man's calm and a mountain man's shoulders, watching a deal worth more than most men would ever see in a lifetime. $50,000 in gold, promised in a single signature. One wrong word in that translation, and Josiah would lose the biggest bargain he'd ever fought for. One wrong word, and the Nakota would believe a lie had been slid under their chief's name, a theft of land dressed up as agreement, and the next thing anyone heard would be rifles and war cries across the valley. One wrong word, and the trading post itself would burn in the fallout. Josiah's license revoked, his supply routes cut, his name posted with a reward like a hunted animal's. Not just a broken deal, but a ruined life. Samuel Wicks, the hired translator, stood between the worlds with polished confidence, sweat shining at his hairline as if it were only heat and not fear. He lifted the contract higher, smiling too quickly, as though speed could bury doubt. Mabel stood near the back, apron still dusted with flour, thick braids slipping loose over her shoulder. She was the kitchen girl, the invisible one, the one men called too slow and too soft to matter. And yet her eyes locked on Tatanka Mani's mouth as if every syllable were a loaded chamber, because she had heard it, clear as a bell in her mother's tongue. 2 winters, not forever. The terrifying part was not the guns, or the silence, or the way Tatanka Mani's gaze sharpened like flint. The terrifying part was that Samuel Wicks looked at Mabel, and, for the first time, his smile did not reach his eyes. He knew she understood. Before we rewind 3 days to learn why the girl in the corner dared to cut through a gold deal with a gun pointed at the table, tell me this: where are you right now, and what are you doing as you hear this moment begin? Fort Belknap Trading Post stood where the prairie bent toward river and timber, a place built less on law and more on leverage. Here, beaver pelts traded for rifles, rifles for whiskey, whiskey for promises, and sometimes promises for land. Paper mattered, but only if the men with guns agreed it did. The walls were thick logs, the roof tarred canvas patched more than once after hard winters. Wagons rolled in heavy and left lighter. Rumors moved faster than freight. In Fort Belknap, reputation was currency, and trust was thinner than parchment. Josiah McAllister had earned both fear and respect here. They called him a gold boss, but he had not begun that way. He had swung a pickaxe before he ever signed a ledger. He knew the weight of ore in his palm and the cost of men who never came back from a shaft collapse. He had the size of a mountain man and the restraint of someone who had seen what greed did when it went unchecked. He did not want blood over this land. He wanted access, not conquest. A limited lease, 2 winters to test the claim, enough gold to keep his company alive without carving permanent scars into Nakota territory. Tatanka Mani, chief of the Nakota delegation, I wanted something just as firm. Dignity. The land was not a commodity to him. It was inheritance, burial ground, memory. If he agreed to anything, it would be on terms that preserved face before his warriors and elders. Between them stood Samuel Wicks, fluent on paper, confident in tone, hired because he claimed he knew both tongues and the delicate space between them. And then there was Mabel Crane. She moved between kitchen hearth and hall with plates balanced on broad hands, quiet and steady. Men rarely looked at her twice. Some laughed when she passed, making careless jokes about appetite and size. A merchant once nudged another and muttered that at least she could not be blown away by prairie wind. Pearl-white porcelain cups were handed to Celeste-like wives and visiting traders with courtesy. Mabel was handed empty buckets and told to hurry. At the water line one morning, two women edged her out of place as if she were excess weight. In the ration queue, a trader waved her aside, declaiming priority. She stepped back each time without argument. But she listened. She had grown up hearing Nakota at her mother's knee. She knew the cadence of respect, the way elders shaped a phrase when speaking of land versus borrowing it. She knew the difference between seasonal use and permanent surrender. Language was not vocabulary. It was memory. Josiah noticed her the first evening he arrived, not because she tried to be seen, but because she spoke gently to an elderly Nakota woman in perfect unbroken phrasing while refilling her cup. The elder's lined face softened. That softness did not go unnoticed. "You understand her?" Josiah had asked quietly later. "A little," Mabel replied, eyes lowered. "Enough to be polite." He had studied her then, not her body, but her steadiness. Still, when negotiations were scheduled, he walked into the hall with the translator he had hired, because business required credentials, because no one had told him yet that the most dangerous man in the room was the one smiling with the contract in hand, and because trusting the wrong voice can feel safer than trusting the unseen one. But as the first round of talks began and Samuel Wicks spoke smoothly on Josiah's behalf, Tatanka Mani did not nod the way a man nods when he agrees. He nodded the way a man does when he is waiting. 3 days before Mabel's voice split the hall in two, Josiah believed he had prepared for every risk except betrayal from within. He had learned caution young. At 15, he had survived a raid that left his parents dead beside a burned wagon. He remembered smoke thick enough to choke the sky and the silence afterward, the kind that presses against the ears until you understand no one is coming back. A Nakota family found him wandering half delirious and brought him into their camp. For 3 winters he learned their language, their hunting routes, the unspoken etiquette of council fires. He learned that a promise about land was never casual. It was sacred. Then soldiers came. A skirmish sparked from mistranslated orders and panicked gunfire. By dawn, the camp that had sheltered him was gone. Josiah survived again. Others did not. From that day forward, one conviction settled into him like iron. A single wrong word could spill more blood than a bullet. Building McAllister Gold Company had not been about wealth alone. It had been about control. If he could negotiate fairly, if he could write agreements that honored both sides, perhaps he could prevent another misunderstanding from turning fatal. He would take profit, yes, but not at the cost of massacre. Mabel carried a different kind of scar. Her mother had spoken Nakota softly at night and English carefully in daylight. Her father had insisted she answer to both. Neither world claimed her fully. Among white settlers, she was too indigenous, too broad, too inconvenient. Among some Nakota, she was a reminder of compromise. She learned early that speaking up invited correction. Better to shrink, better to serve, so she perfected invisibility. When she brought Stu into the negotiation hall on the first day, she kept her eyes down and her ears open. Tatanka Mani's voice was measured. He spoke of sharing hunting grounds for a time, of returning land after snow had fallen twice. He used the phrase Nupa Wanietu clearly, deliberately. T. Samuel Wicks translated without hesitation. He agrees to permanent transfer for $50,000 in gold. Josiah did not flinch. On paper, that was what he hoped for. But something in the chief's posture unsettled him. Tatanka Mani's jaw tightened. The warriors behind him did not relax. That night, Josiah reassured himself, Wicks had credentials from other posts. The paperwork was standard. He had lawyers waiting in Helena. Everything is under control, he told himself. False reassurance is often the calm before collapse. On the second day, Mabel heard Tatanka Mani repeat the seasonal phrasing, slower this time, emphasizing duration. Wicks again rendered it as permanence, no hesitation, no nuance. Mabel's hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped a kettle. She could remain silent and keep her place in the kitchen, or she could speak and risk being crushed between two powers who would not tolerate embarrassment. All her life she had been told she misunderstood things, that she was too sensitive, too loud when she protested, too quiet when she did not. Now she understood perfectly, and that clarity felt more dangerous than ignorance. Because when Tatanka Mani ended a sentence with a particular inflection, a warning hidden in tone, Mabel recognized it immediately. It was not agreement. It was a test. And if no one corrected the translation soon, the test would become a trap. Samuel Wicks had the kind of confidence that filled a room before his words did. He dressed sharper than most men at Fort Belknap, boots polished, waistcoat fitted, spectacles perched low on his nose, as if scholarship alone guaranteed honesty. He spoke Nakota with dramatic pauses and sweeping gestures, as though language were theater and he its star performer. Most people were impressed. Josiah, at first, had been relieved. A fluent translator meant smoother negotiations, fewer risks. The trading post master certainly approved. "Sign it quick," the man had muttered more than once. "Winter's coming. No need to complicate things with tribal poetry." A visiting fur merchant laughed openly at Mabel one afternoon when she'd lingered too long near the hall. "Kitchen's that way," he said, "unless you're planning to advise on land policy." Even one of Tatanka Mani's younger warriors eyed her warily, suspicion etched into his expression. She was neither fully settler nor fully Nakota. On intense moments, ambiguity looks like danger. Wicks thrived in that atmosphere. On the evening of the second day, Mabel carried fresh coffee past the storage corridor and heard low voices where there should have been none. She slowed, heart hammering. "Once it's signed, Harmon and Sons will step in," Wicks was saying quietly. "McAllister won't survive the backlash. You'll have leverage on both sides." Another voice answered, indistinct but approving. Mabel did not hear coins clink, but she saw the small leather pouch change hands when she dared glance around the corner. Wicks turned slightly. For half a breath his eyes met hers, not startled, not ashamed, measuring. He smiled faintly, as if daring her to understand what she had witnessed. Later that night, she repeated the Nakota phrase in her head over and over. Nupa Wanietu. 2 winters. A temporary right, not surrender, not sale. Words like that were not decorative. They defined ownership, honor, survival. If mistranslated, they became accusations. Josiah stood alone outside his quarters when she finally approached him. The lantern light cut sharp lines across his face. "You're certain?" he asked quietly, after she finished explaining what she heard and what she feared. "I am," she said. "He keeps replacing seasons with forever." Josiah studied her for a long moment. "If you are wrong, you destroy my credibility. If you are right—" He did not finish the sentence. "If I am right," Mabel whispered, "you prevent a war." He tested her then, softly, in Nakota. "How would you say shared passage through hunting land?" Without hesitation, she answered correctly, adjusting for dialect. Something shifted in his expression. Trust did not come easily to Josiah McAllister, but recognition did. "Tomorrow," he said at last, "you stand where you can hear every word." Mabel swallowed. "If I speak in that hall, they could hang me for sabotage." He nodded once. "Yes." She drew a breath that tasted like fear and resolve mixed together. "I'll still be there." Day 1. The negotiation hall at Fort Belknap smelled of ink, tobacco, and tension. Josiah sat at the long table, posture steady, hands resting near but not on his holster. Across from him, Tatanka Mani remained composed, dignity woven into every line of his face. Warriors stood behind him like carved stone. Samuel Wicks occupied the narrow bridge between them. He translated smoothly, confidently, a voice never wavering. He replaced nuance with certainty, softened caution into agreement. To an untrained ear, it sounded flawless. Mabel stood near the rear wall, carrying a tray she no longer noticed. She watched Tatanka Mani's eyes more than she listened to Wicks's voice. The chief did not nod at the moments Wicks implied consent. He did not relax when Wicks declared mutual understanding. But no one else seemed to see it. "Terms acceptable," Wicks concluded on the first afternoon. Tatanka Mani's expression did not change, but he did not confirm in the way a leader confirms peace. Mabel felt the first crack of dread open beneath her ribs. Day 2. Pressure grew. The postmaster urged speed. "Snow won't wait. Sign it. Move the gold." The merchant who mocked Mabel muttered that indigenous negotiations were ceremony over substance. Wicks agreed with a thin smile. Mabel volunteered to serve directly beside the table that day. Close enough to hear the Nakota syllables before they were reshaped. Tatanka Mani spoke again of seasons, again of return, again of shared use. Wicks translated permanent claim. Mabel's pulse roared in her ears. She looked at Josiah. He remained unreadable, but something in his jaw tightened. Later, outside, he spoke quietly to her. "If I ask him in Nakota how many winters, and he answers differently than Wicks translates, what will you do?" "Speak," she said. "You understand what that means?" "Yes." He studied her a moment longer, then gave a single nod. Night 2. Under lantern light, Josiah tested her again. He spoke a short phrase in Nakota, deliberately simple. She corrected his tense gently and answered in full. He switched dialect. She followed. Silence settled between them, heavy, but no longer doubtful. "I believe you," he said at last. and belief, once given, changed everything. But trust is dangerous when corruption is listening. Across the yard, Samuel Wicks watched from shadow. Day 3. The final draft lay ready. $50,000, permanent transfer of mineral rights, exclusive extraction. All that remained was signature. The hall filled early, settlers eager for prosperity. Nakota warriors, alert, guarded. The air tasted metallic. The postmaster leaned toward Josiah. End it clean. Wicks adjusted the document, smoothing its edges as if calming a restless animal. Mabel took her place along the wall. Tatanka Mani began to speak. Each sentence was measured, each word deliberate. Wicks translated confidently. But when the chief said Nupa Wanietu once more, slower this time, emphasizing the boundary of time, Wicks said, "Forever." Josiah did not move. He looked at Mabel, not asking yet, but waiting. All it would take was ink touching paper. All it would take was silence, and no one could undo it. Josiah's voice broke the tension. "On the day of signing," he said calmly, eyes never leaving Wicks, "every word will be heard twice." Mabel felt the room shift, because now the decision was no longer private. It was public. The hall fell into a silence so tight it felt like a drawn bowstring. Tatanka Mani finished his sentence, the final phrase deliberate, unhurried. The words were clear. Nupa Wanietu, 2 winters, shared passage, return. Samuel Wicks did not hesitate. "He agrees," Wicks declared smoothly, "to permanent transfer of land and mineral rights in exchange for $50,000. And that was the moment Mabel understood something else. He was not afraid of being caught. He was certain no one would challenge him. The realization hit her like cold water. If she spoke, she would be alone. If she stayed silent, dozens might die in a conflict that would follow. She did not remember deciding to move. She only remembered the sound of her own voice tearing through the hall. "Your translator is lying." The word struck like a gunshot. A chair scraped violently across the floor. A warrior's hand flew to his rifle. Ink splashed as the contract jarred beneath Wicks's hand. Tatanka Mani rose slowly, eyes sharp, unreadable. Josiah stood, but he did not reach for his weapon. He looked at Mabel. "Are you certain?" he asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. The question was not gentle. It was a trial. Every eye in the hall turned toward her. The postmaster's face had gone white with fury. The merchant smirked as if waiting for spectacle. Wicks's expression flickered for the first time. Mabel's mouth felt dry, but her voice did not tremble. "He said 2 winters," she said clearly. "Shared use. After that, the land returns." Wicks barked a laugh. "She's confused. She overheard fragments. She wants attention." Tatanka Mani raised one hand, silencing the noise, without effort. Then he did something no one expected. He spoke again in Nakota, and when he finished, he pointed, not at Wicks, at Mabel. "You," he said in English, accented but firm. "You speak." The hall inhaled as one. Wicks's confidence cracked. Josiah did not intervene. This was no longer his question. It was hers. Mabel stepped forward into the open space between 2 worlds. She translated slowly, carefully, honoring structure and intent. She preserved the limits. She preserved the seasons. She preserved the dignity. 2 winters, not forever. When she finished, silence followed. Then Tatanka Mani nodded once. Samuel Wicks's face drained of color, and in that single nod, the balance of power shifted. But exposure was not yet victory, because Wicks was not done. Samuel Wicks did not collapse under accusation. He attacked. "She twists phrasing," he snapped, voice sharp now, stripped of polish. "Seasonal language in Nakota is metaphorical. It implies continuity, permanence through renewal." That is what he meant. A murmur rippled through the settlers. Wicks turned to Josiah. "You built a company on precision. Are you really going to gamble $50,000 on a kitchen girl's interpretation?" The insult hung in the air. Mabel felt it land, but she did not retreat. Tatanka Mani spoke again, this time shorter, his tone unmistakably firmer. Wicks translated quickly. "He says misunderstanding dishonors both sides." Mabel shook her head. "That's not what he said." Josiah's gaze sharpened. "Then what did he say?" Mabel did not rush. "He said," she translated steadily, "that if a man changes the length of an agreement, he changes the honor of it." The words settled heavily. One of the Nakota warriors stepped forward half a pace. The tension tipped toward violence. Wicks pivoted, desperate now. "Ask him directly in English, then. If he wants 2 winters, let him say it plainly." Tatanka Mani did not look at Wicks. He looked at Josiah. Then he spoke in halting but clear English. 2 winters, then land returns." The hall froze. There was no room left for interpretation. Wicks' mouth opened, but nothing came. Josiah moved first, not toward his gun, but toward the contract. He lifted it, turned it so all could see the inked word permanent. He met Tatanka Mani's eyes. "This document," he said evenly, "does not reflect your words." Tatanka Mani inclined his head once. Josiah tore the page cleanly in half. The sound was louder than any shout. Gasps erupted. The postmaster sputtered. The merchant swore under his breath. Wicks lunged as if to snatch the remaining papers, but 2 guards seized his arms. "You were paid," Josiah said quietly, not as a question. Wicks' silence answered. Tatanka Mani spoke to his warriors in low tones. No rifles were raised, no shots fired. Instead, something rarer happened. Respect held. A new document was drafted that afternoon. Temporary mineral access, la shared oversight. 2 winters, clearly written. When it was signed in full view of both sides. No one cheered, but no one reached for a weapon either. As the hall slowly emptied, the merchant who had mocked Mabel avoided her eyes. The postmaster said nothing. Even the skeptical warrior regarded her differently now, not with warmth, but with acknowledgment. Josiah approached her last. "You understood what was at stake," he said quietly. "So did you," she answered. He shook his head slightly. "I almost didn't." There was no grand declaration, no spectacle, only a simple truth spoken aloud. "You saved more than a contract today." For the first time since stepping into that hall, Mabel stood not at the edge, but at the center. The hall felt different the next morning. No gun smoke had stained the beams. No blood had darkened the wooden floor. Yet something fundamental had shifted, as if the air itself had been cleared. Our word traveled quickly across Fort Belknap. The gold deal had not collapsed. The Nakota had not declared betrayal. No bounty had been posted for Josiah McAllister. Instead, a corrected agreement stood, 2 winters, clearly written, witnessed by both sides. The merchant who once mocked Mabel kept his voice low when she passed. The postmaster, who had urged haste, spoke cautiously now, aware that his impatience had nearly sparked disaster. Even the skeptical Nakota warrior inclined his head slightly when she crossed the yard. It was not affection. It was acknowledgment. For the first time, no one referred to her as the kitchen girl. They used her name. Tatanka Mani remained at the post one additional day before returning to his people. Before he left, he addressed Josiah formally, and then, unexpectedly, Mabel. In a room where many heard, he said in steady English, "You listened." He touched his chest lightly, then gestured toward her. Honor recognized. Josiah stood beside her, but did not speak over her. When the trading hall emptied entirely, and only dust motes moved in the late afternoon light, Mabel lingered near the doorway. For months she had occupied corners, edges, thresholds. Now she stood in the center of the room where her voice had changed its course. Josiah approached quietly. "You understand," he said, not unkindly. "Harmon and Sons will not forget this." She nodded. "Neither will I." Outside, the prairie wind carried the scent of approaching winter. Fort Belknap was calm, but power rarely forgives humiliation, and somewhere beyond the horizon, men who had lost leverage were already reconsidering their next move. On the frontier, people believe wars begin with gunfire. Sometimes they begin with a single word. At Fort Belknap, $50,000 nearly changed hands. Land nearly changed ownership. Honor nearly turned into accusation. And all because one man replaced 2 winters with forever. It was not the loudest voice in the room that prevented bloodshed. It was the one no one expected to hear. Courage does not always look like a drawn revolver. Sometimes it looks like a young woman stepping out of the corner and saying, clearly, "That is not what he said." In a land where translation can mean survival, truth becomes a form of protection. Josiah learned that reputation is not proof. Tatanka Mani proved that dignity listens before it strikes, and Mabel discovered that invisibility is not destiny. The most underestimated person in the room may be the only one who understands what is truly being said. So tell me this. If you were Josiah, would you trust the polished translator with credentials, or the kitchen girl willing to risk everything to speak the truth? And right now, as this story closes, where are you and what are you doing?